Hi, I'm Jacquire King. I'm at the UA Playground in Santa Cruz, California. We've been recording Robot Monster here, tracking session, drums, and guitar. I wanted to just walk you through the recording setup and just talk a little bit about the signal path, mic placement, and how I'm going about getting the sound that we have. The drum miking, I prefer simplicity, especially in all recording, especially with drums, because the more microphones you add into it, just the more complicated it gets. Now, I do have several drum tracks, but they're all to kind of combine and make a unified sound. This is probably the most important part of the drum miking technique in terms of the style of it and the way that it functions, and then the way I look to fill it in. It's a very somewhat famous drum miking technique that Glyn Johns created, and then another British engineer from Abbey Road that I would say I borrow a little bit of inspiration from is Jeff Emmerich, but I kind of also sort of have my own twists on it. So the Glyn Johns technique is two microphones functioning as the overheads. So the microphone that's over the top of the kit in mono is my right side of the stereo image. So I do things audience perspective. And then the left side is the same microphone. It's a matched pair of microphones. It's over here next to the floor tom. They are TL2 414s. The TL2s have C12 capsules in them. The very important part about this is that the microphones are equal distance from the snare drum. So you basically are making an equilateral triangle. And that's important so that, because it is a little bit skewed in the way that it presents the stereo field, but to keep the snare drum very much in the center, and the kick drum as well. The microphones hear the drum kit a little bit differently, obviously, but the reason to keep them equidistant from the snare is so that the volume of the snare drum basically is fairly equal. I am not miking the rack tom. This miking technique, when done properly, it takes a little bit of listening and adjusting. The rack tom is always very present and loud enough in the this overhead. I'm also not miking the hi-hat because that microphone also picks that up quite well, and when I pan it over to the right, audience perspective, there's plenty of hi-hat over there, and the rack tom as well. So when the rack tom is played, it feels very much over to the right where I would like it to be. But the snare drum, because I've measured the microphones to be equidistant, still stays kind of in the center. The side mic is very close to the floor tom, and having the microphone close to the floor tom really gives you that powerful impact. And what's also quite nice about it is because the microphone is looking across the kit, it's picking up a decent amount of the ride cymbal. Let's talk about signal chain a little bit. I've used API pre's on everything, and then there is API EQ, the 550, and then that goes to an 1176, just to bring the transients in and kind of get things to sit. And then there's an EQ post-compression to further shape towards the EQ curve that I'd like to have on the overheads. The placement of the kick drum mic, I don't particularly care for a kick drum mic that's too far in the drum. You get a lot of shell resonance. The low end isn't able to develop enough. And if you're using the proper head and the right kick drum beater, you're going to get enough kind of snap and articulation out of it. I don't need to cram a mic all the way in there. I like it just on the outside here, and the microphone is slightly pointing up at the beater. So I'm definitely focusing on the articulate sound, but it's back in a way that the low end can develop, and you're kind of capturing a more whole sound from the drum, but it's also close enough to the drum that it kind of creates a little bit of an acoustic shadow, if you will, so you're not getting a ton of leakage. The signal path for the kick drum involves an API pre, then an API EQ, and then I'm using a DBX 160 for just a little bit of dynamic control on the way in So the 160 is just kind of just kissing it a little bit. Shouldn't be moving the meter very much, and it's a low ratio. It's just kind of reeling in a little bit. From there, I would probably just mention the snare drum mic. It's in a pretty typical spot, just over the drum just a little bit, pointing basically to where Logan is striking the drum. I decided to use the SD1. It gives me all the same feelings of an SM7, but it feels like a modern update. It's very good. It doesn't require as much back-end work, EQ and so forth. But the reason I chose it as a snare drum mic is it does have a little bit more body than a 57, and so it just kind of, it makes a tougher, more impactful sound. Everything's an API pre, and then we go on to EQ, which is another 550. Pre-compression, use a distressor for compression, as you can see. Why on a mono channel do I have the stereo link on the distressor for the snare drum? Because when you do that with the distressor, it changes the way that the threshold looks at the incoming signal, and it's that switch is there to have it paired with another unit in stereo. So it's not only is it taking into account the level that it's seeing internally, but it's also paying attention to basically a sidechain input. And because that sidechain input isn't actually there, it kind of freaks the circuit out a little bit, and it imparts a little bit more distortion, just slightly, a little more color when it starts to go into compression and hit it. So I like that sound because it's giving me a little bit more harmonic content around the transient especially. Then there's a EQ afterwards, which is the Trident EQ, and I chose that just because they have a very signature sound. It's very 70s rock and roll. And then I guess we would move on to this microphone, kind of a kit microphone, is a Sphere. Awesome piece of technology. It helps fill in with what the side mic is on the overhead, and just kind of gives a nice warm feeling. I use this as an overall kit mic. It's very close to the shell of the kick drum. You know, you got a very kind of wooden tonal quality from the kick drum. It's kind of looking at the snare drum. The signal path on that, like I said, everything's an API pre. We're using the Sphere, so we have the emulation in there, and it's set to a 47. From that, we go into another EQ, and as you can see, I've sort of dumped the high end off of the signal, of the record path, a lot, because it's so close to the ride cymbal. The ride cymbal is still going to come through, but I don't have all that really super bright wash from it. It's more of the tonal body of it. And then I really beat it up with a Fatso. It's a pretty aggressive amount of compression. And so it's not a sound that's used in a great deal. It's kind of blended in, and it kind of gives character and shape to the drum sound. There's a harmonica mic, it's a green bullet. It has a very limited frequency range. It was designed and intended for harmonica. I use it for this particular application because it is frequency limited. It kind of sounds, you know, it doesn't sound, it's not hi-fi, that's for sure. And I've put it close to the kit. It's just in front of the kick drum. I'm always looking for like interesting low frequency color stuff in different places so that kind of all comes together, so that my close mics are the articulation, the clarity, and the focus, and then these other elements are ways that I can combine in tonal colors. And I play with the panning a little bit, especially with this overhead technique. You know, these overheads are hearing the drums differently. The one that's next to the floor tom, well, obviously it's got a lot more floor tom in it, but it hears the kick drum differently than the overhead. And so I might choose to put something on the right side, perhaps this green bullet mic, a little bit over to the right to sort of balance out the color of what's happening on the side mic. Before we go to the room mics, there's one more closest element to the drum kit, and it's a little bit hard to see, but it's back behind the drum throne. There's a few companies that make a very specific device for capturing the subsonic frequencies of a kick drum. You know, it sort of started with putting an NS10 speaker in front of a kick drum, but I use it behind the kit because I want a different sound. I want a sound that's a little bit more inclusive in sort of in the way that I'm using the kit mic to capture a little bit of the shell resonance off the kick drum. Having the sub microphone, that speaker microphone, not only do you get an interesting low end that has more time to develop, but Logan's body is also acting like a baffle from the cymbals because it's down low behind him. He's sort of acoustically shadowing that. Then I can really just kind of focus on this cool, developed, low-frequency stuff that has useful leakage in it. The signal path is an API pre, an API EQ. You can see that I'm taking a lot of the high frequency off of it. And then the compression that I'm using is very exaggerated. So next we have the Royer SF24 stereo room capture mic. So the microphone placement for the rooms is I walk around and I find the places that sound the most balanced and kind of give me a room tone that I'm after. This spot's good for the low end and the unifying sound of what the space is doing. But the cymbals were too hot, so I tipped the microphone to where it's not looking directly at the drums. And that signal path is API pre, API Q. It doesn't look like I really did much with the EQ. It's there, and then used a Fairchild for some old school room compression. Also, we have a sphere set up as a Coles for a distant room mic. And this is just to kind of capture ambience that's a bit far away, as ambient as possible, has the most reverb time. So there's a little bit of EQ. You can see that I've dumped the high end off again. You know, this style of rock music, there's a lot of cymbal work, and it can be somewhat aggressive. And that's tough, you know, to capture because it's such a dominant sound with all these microphones around. You know, like where I don't need it and I'm just looking for additive color and character for some of these other microphones, this is why I'm getting rid of so much of the high end. I could do it later, but then it's something to think about unnecessarily. There's a little bit of LA2A compression, not really to hammer it into place in such a way of where I'm doing some of the more aggressive compression with these closer microphones. I don't want to blow the room up too much on the way in because I want to give myself a little bit of latitude. Just kind of want to get an interesting perspective to blend together. There's 9 microphones total on the drums. 6 of them are in pretty close proximity, and then I have the speaker Subkick behind the kit, sort of medium close, and then the 2 room pictures. And it's just to kind of give me the different perspectives and be able to balance things in. I want the clarity of the close mics, and it really is about filling out that primary 3 that I started the whole thing about with the kick drum and the overheads. You could turn off all the rest and you'd have a perfectly good drum sound. The rest of it is to add dimension. The room sounds, not only do they fill the sound out, but having these other things to go to in the arrangement when I'm mixing and presenting the final recording, I can turn the room sounds up at the bigger sections of the song to kind of give the listener the experience of being in the room and things getting louder and the energy increasing. And just, you know, because everything we're doing in recording is, you know, we're not trying to kill all the dynamic, but we're trying to control it so that we have a consistent presentation. And so in doing that, it kind of, you know, we're kind of like limiting, you know, how much dynamic movement is kind of allowed to have, so that you have the consistency, and then you need these other elements sort of separate so that you can then reintroduce some dynamic and change in the the space, the sense of being in an acoustic space, and just kind of add dynamic and energy into it. In the same way that if you were in a room, it's just like if Logan were to go from playing medium velocity and he gets to a bigger part of the song, he's going to dig in more. Well, with the way all this is set up, the close mics, especially the ones that have compression on them or more extreme compression, they're going to go into more compression. It's going to get tighter feeling. So having the room sounds to push up and kind of fill that back in is what's essential.